record button on my side. Okay, great. All right. So, I mean, you've already mentioned to me, some of your background and fields of expertise. Now that, I've started recording, maybe if you can just let me know, when did your interest in youth and youth development start? How long have you been focusing on the area?
Yep. So in 2010, I used to work at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a think tank in Kenya. And so I was really looking for a futures project to do. And I was looking for a topic that would then fit the bill of a good futures project. And the more I sort of like researched, the more it kept pointing at this issue about young people. There was a lot of talk about, young people are becoming many, but you could tell in the policy spaces and discussions, there wasn't a language or even a method to all that, that kind of intuition around youth issues. And so I picked it up. And the first place to start was to really think about what are the facts and figures around youth in Kenya. And there's an interesting book we published called the Youth Fact Book. It's actually online. The Youth Fact Book then just gave it was like a one-stop shop that really just put together available information, secondary data that, but just gives you a picture in one book on what the status of youth looks like. Obviously, then it began to really give the story of young people because, the way policy is structured is that it's very pipeline, if you may, very disintegrated in terms of whether it's ministries or different disciplines. And so that's one of the undoing of, because life, a young person is experiencing life in all spheres. So in a sense, that book was able to do that, bring in the experience of young people and then have that central story. And it's a book that was really published, or rather, it really took a big interest. I remember presenting it in a church, in a group of pastors, about 400 of them. Sure. And I remember different people then saying, oh my goodness, this is the place where we cut budgets. This is the place where we don't pay attention. And so I could tell that there was a sense of urgency that was created. Within the policy spaces, a lot of youth organizations that had been trying to do policy work around youth had never had a chance to really articulate why this thing is urgent. But with that publication, within, I think, a year or two, there was such an increase in budgets, even within national government, to almost 21 times. And so it was very interesting for me to see then that give, in a sense, a method to the madness. The second part of the project was looking at what young Kenyans think about the future of the bulging youth population in Kenya. And that was interesting for me because how I designed the project was that instead of just having a group of experts, by the way, we also did a research compendium, which then putting together publications around just youth issues in different, much more detailed research. And then the last part of the project was then the youth study, the foresight studies. And so I held about 11 workshops countrywide, 8 of them in the 8 regions of the country, to have young people from those areas discuss what they see the future. What was interesting from those discussions was how it's as if we were talking to 8 different countries of young people because of the experiences. But for me, collectively, there was a very bleak future. And so anyway, we published that work in a publication that is also online called Kenya Youth Scenarios, in short, KEYS, Keys. Okay. And that also took a bit of traction, but what was interesting to watch was that policymakers completely freaked out about some of the things. There was even a video that we posted. It wasn't very well done, but it passes on the message about what young people think about the future. For me, what was interesting is it created much more fear than proactive reaction and strategy thinking around the future of youth in Kenya. But by and large, and what it painted was an angry set of young people that wanted to, in a sense, in fact, there are some cartoons I could send you. We created based on the report, the future map of Kenya that had a northern part removed and the coast part removed. because they were saying they were going to secede at the time. So for the security forces in Kenya, I mean, they just descended on those particular areas to quell those kinds of movements and conversations. But for me, I think it elicited such interesting, it even gave language to politicians. 2013, you could, a lot of political campaign strategies were based on that, the language in the book and so forth. And people prioritize that as an agenda. And it was interesting to watch. So of course, subsequently, a lot of then work came. I was asked to replicate a similar project Africa-wide and to, in a sense, use the same methodology to question Agenda 2063 of the Africa Union and what we think about a bulging youth population in the context of Africa, but also in the context of Agenda 2063. So it's been an interesting journey in that regard, and just following a lot of the publications that have come out and the interests that have come out around youth in Kenya, but also in Africa as well.
Oh, that's great. I mean, thank you very much for kind of referring me to the kind of documents and the publications that you've mentioned. And I must definitely read through them and add it to the report. I mean, at this point, I think it's still very thin. So that would be a big help. And I mean, so to think how those publications contributed to influencing policymakers. But maybe before we go into other questions, before I forget, you said that it brought up, and that seems to be something that comes up with the youth bulge. Youth are either seen as being a threat or this great opportunity. And so for you saw policymakers or kind of officials responding more with a sense of fear than opportunity. So and the response seemed to be to maybe send out the military or send the army to the different regions of Kenya. What other kind of responses did you see?
I think one of the big ones is also tokenization. The fact that young people then are seen as many, they're seen as needy, but they're seen as people generally, and I'm talking widely in terms of policy, as people you tokenize, so that even when you design projects and programs, you're thinking about, actually, let me give you a short story. I once, because of this work on futures thinking, I was involved in a project to discuss Kenya Vision 2030. And the vision originally was an economic vision only. And part of our contribution was that the country is not just based on the economy. I mean, if the political systems and institutions that are supposed to support the economy are not working, then it completely sort of like nullifies the purpose for which you're doing the economic vision. And so if social cohesion is not there and the social issues are not sorted out, again, the same problem. And so our very strong contribution was you have to look at, if it's a country's vision, you have to look at, the holistic picture. And so the political and the social were added into the project, which was an interesting contribution. So I get in, of course, because of that, the director says, why don't you come and be part of the team that crafts the vision? And I remember we were sitting there, so dividing the roles, and one gentleman says, you look like the youngest of them. So why don't you do this youth chapter in women? And then, of course, you give all these ideas based on the research that you've done and so forth. And then as he was reading through the draft, he said, listen, young lady, these young people, you just give them, he used the Kiswahili phrase, but it means, listen, we are not here to, discuss affirmative action and discuss those big things. We just need to keep them silent. So give them something small to keep them busy. And so if you're suggesting, sports, stadiums and things that will keep them busy, then we will, that passes. So for me, it also shows people at the highest level then begin to treat the youth issue as one that can just be ignored and tokenized. So long as they're silent and not causing any problems, then you're okay. We have quelled them enough to be able to continue with the status quo. And what the futures work then began to show is that, look, we are not willing to be, we would like to do something much bigger. And youth themselves do recognize that, yeah, they can be active agents of change, but they also recognize that they also need a means of livelihood. So in terms of them wanting to engage as agents of change and remember the status quo, and in a sense, that kind of attitude comes in. And so this need for money that these young people have, but then this need for keep them busy but not bring change comes in, and there's, you can give resources, you can tokenize, and, each is happy. But then this, instead of becoming the youth becoming an agent of change, they become a destructive force. Okay. And in the scenarios, the youth did acknowledge that, yes, we can be different things. We can actually be passive and we can be agents of change, but we can also be destructive. So they did see themselves in different roles, and depending on who you are, what your character is, what the circumstances are, you could fall into any of the three boxes. So the big one I would say is tokenization.
Sure.
No, and if you look at projects and programs, and you study them closely, there's a bit of that within policy projects and proposals.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that we had initial conversations, and that's something we were wondering about. I mean, but I'm hoping I'm just making some notes as we go, so that I can hopefully pull it into a question that's coming. I mean, I know I have a tendency to just jump onto something that might say, but hopefully keep track of it and pull it in. So maybe just to focus on the policy side of things, how would you describe the current youth policy development or the policy environment in Kenya? How would you kind of describe it at the moment?
So, so are you asking about policies around youth?
Yes.
Or youth?
Yeah, more particularly around youth, maybe youth development and policies that are really focusing on youth.
All right. So I think to answer that question, one must ask or review the policy-making process. It's, first of all, just like anything, it's not neutral. The people who work on it have their own interests. Remember, policy-making is a political process. And so there are a lot of vested interests. And what some young people have done, there's usually what is called youth inclusion. But my sense of it is that it doesn't include, I don't know whether to say the real youth, because there are some who have positioned themselves as gatekeepers, as people who then get the opportunities, people who will then go there, give views. But are those views representative? These are young people also who are privileged in one way or another, who then have found opportunities or means of survival. And so they come in and say, and the government is happy to say, look, we got youth voices were heard. But really the question becomes, are those the real voices of young people? Having then said that, again, look at who's making the policies. It is older people. How do they define youth? Because the name you give to something does define how you treat it, right? If it's not valuable to you, and if it's not valuable to you in a sense, you don't treat it with that kind of value. So if young people, if older people, for example, feel that youth are to be seen and not heard, if their definition inherently is about youth are there to be tokenized, then obviously you will see it in the program development. So, and for me, so that there is some, to be politically correct, they do say they have included young people, but for me, the young people that are included are gatekeepers. Yeah. And those gatekeepers then don't represent the voices of young people. Yeah. The other thing about the policies that are made, in my view, is that like every other policy as a, whether it's a process or as a discipline, needs to be redefined, because again, you see, life is not categorized into different things. So one of the things I have seen in Kenya is that they're having trouble, say, locating where the youth ministry, for example, should sit. So on one time it's under social, gender and social services. Another time it's under ICT. You see, and so that movement and the fact that you don't think, first of all, it's important enough for it to warrant its own ministry. The fact that you cannot even decide where it sits. Remember, there are health issues, but those people don't even talk to each other with the ICT ministry or with the Ministry of Youth, Gender and Social Services. And so there are a lot of things that then fall through the cracks. And so the policy itself doesn't address the holistic issues of young people. And that's one of the biggest things. So there's a vested interest, there's issues around policy being not being able to address the holistic issues of young people. And so for me, again, the definitions that they give to youth and the attitude they have, then it becomes tokenistic.
Sure.
In the book I was doing for my thesis, for my doctoral studies, I actually did a book on what's the future of youth employment. And I was looking at the structural constraints of just youth and employment, first of all, because we then prescribe policy as if there isn't a history. One doesn't ask, why did we get here in the first place, and what needs to be fixed before we prescribe a solution. So if you look at unemployment, first of all, it has everything to do, historically, has everything to do with neoliberal policies, but also has everything to do with demographics. So if you don't link youth policies to health, then there's obviously, you're not addressing the issue. Anyway, I could,
No, I mean, it's great. A lot of the points that you've mentioned, I mean, we've really just touched on. But as you say, who are the youth that are kind of invited to the table, and what are the kind of demographics and backgrounds of these youth, and to what extent are they involved in the political side of policy development is, I mean, it's definitely something that we've started just noticing, but I mean, it's good to hear that you kind of feel the same around that. Maybe just to, I think I'm just watching time. If we potentially went over an hour, would that be a problem for you, or maybe could?
No, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I disappointed you yesterday, so it must be on good behavior to make up for it.
No, that's my lucky day then. So I think, as you've already mentioned, is a lot of the time policy can be a form of, there's an element of tokenism or trying to maintain the status quo, and not always contributing to the real change, as you've mentioned. Does policy, as you've already said, not all youth are represented. Do you think there are other stakeholders that might be kind of excluded? Are all stakeholders kind of involved with this process, or who might not be part of the process?
So one of the things also that a policy doesn't do is to take, you see, like among women, for example, the women's movement has been there, I believe, in all parts of Africa. And if as a subgroup, it has been maybe more advanced in clamoring for their inclusion more than youth, right? But when you look at those women, there are different subcategories, and those categories, all those subcategories, many times never make it to the policy table. So for example, when you look at youth, you have youth from rural areas, you have youth that are not well educated, you have youth that are, remember also, by the way, policy making process is also very elite. And so when you talk about young people that do not have an education or from marginalized communities, to what extent are they able to even understand the lingo or even participate in that process that is so technical, if you may? All right. So you have youth that also are, let's say, of minority groups. So my point is there are many subgroups. And sometimes in the name of inclusion, you don't really have a process that reaches even where they are. You centralize the process, right? You put it in a town, or in our case, it's the Kenyatta Conference Center. And so those people can't reach to that place. The person representing them doesn't have an idea of what that person goes through on a daily basis. And even if they're from that community, they've not grown up in that community in the real sense of the word. probably just were privileged.
Yeah.
And so that elitism for me is because then when you talk about inclusion, you're talking about investment in time and resources. A lot of time the excuse is we don't have that time, we don't have that. If you're really interested in that, in being able to address the issues, then just use whether it's devolved mechanisms that you have to get information from everywhere, and then put it on centralize the information so that there's that sense of inclusion. And then inclusion, by the way, then ceases to mean that I am there when the policy is being done, but are my sentiments being taken into place? You see, even the way the conversations are structured, the language and so forth, that's exclusionary in itself. Have we found and invested ways in which we can make that, accessible to people to shorten the distance? In the policy making process. So that exclusion is there, and it is structural. So unless we address the structural issue of how the policy making process, the problem will still be there. So that we will keep on saying inclusion, and government says, but we included so and so.
Yeah. No, for sure. That's definitely. The whole spatial aspect, the geographical aspect, as you've mentioned, is not only are you meant to be a young person who is within those social circles, or somehow you've had the social capital that allows you into that space, but you also need to probably be from an urban area, and rural youth are much less likely to be involved. And as you also said, the neoliberal aspect of it, all the approaches aren't really going to consider the more agrarian kind of aspects, and the types of programs that might benefit kind of rural youth.
Let me give you an example, just so that it's not so abstract. In the work that I'm telling you I did, we went to a place in northern Kenya, and we got the pastoralists there, sort of like Somalis, but Kenyan Somalis. And they asked me a question I couldn't answer. They said, how do you differentiate? How do you tell someone is a Kenyan? And I said, because they have an ID. He said, precisely. You think because your process of getting an ID did not have barriers, that it is automatic for young people to get IDs. They said, how else do you think the security forces use to identify a Kenyan? And you see, the Somalis, their features are very interesting. So their hair is lighter, and obviously they're Cushitic people. So they're not like what I can call inland. They have a slight difference in terms of whether it's physical appearance, right? And so and by the way, it's very difficult to tell apart a Kenyan Somali and a Somali. So I didn't realize that they're harassed so much. And they said to me, because their hair is so light, the second thing that is used to identify whether they are Kenyan is a birthmark that is usually on the left-hand side. Not a birthmark, but like an immunization mark that usually is here. And a lot of them are pastoralists. So chances are that immunization didn't occur. First of all, they do traditional birth attendance. Hospitals are sort of like too far away from a lot of the women to even go to them. So chances are that a lot of Kenyan Somalis do not have immunization birthmarks or marks. So they say, because of that, I cannot get a Kenyan ID. And because of that, I cannot get access to any service.
Sure.
Now, one would imagine that ID is because that's what gives you the gate pass to a lot of the services, right? Yeah. So for that young person wanting a policy issue to be discussed, their biggest priority will be access to an ID.
Sure.
Right? If you read any policy document on youth, there is no discussion on access to identity cards, because that young person was never involved in that conversation and could never bring out that as an issue. And because anybody else on the policy table, it's obvious for them to get an identity card. That's not something they think about.
Yeah. Wow. Sure. It's kind of amazing. You don't even see that in any youth policy document, in terms of just those most things that you take for granted, that access to being able to register even a child's birth, or then receive an ID, and how you then completely excluded. It doesn't feature. So no, that's
actually, it's very in that book, I get so excited when I discuss this project. In the cartoon, we sort of like drew to represent that kind of narrative, is that you have this young person being kicked out of an official office, an ID office in Kenya, and the Al-Shabaab is beckoning and saying, come, I'll give you an identity. I'll give you a belonging, because that's what an ID represents.
Yeah.
I'll give you access to resources. You see? And so because we are not even, first of all, the policy process is excluding this person. We're not making a correlation between violence, so this person's recruitment into Al-Shabaab, and the exclusion the policy exclusion that we have.
Yeah. And I think the thing that's surprised me so much is how basic that is. I mean, to think that still young people are not having the facilities, or that, I mean, in the areas that they live, they might not have the ability to register in that way. And it seems something so simple, but it still exists and it's still out there contributing to such big problems. So I mean, no, thank you for that. I think there's definitely something that's overlooked. And I mean, I guess my own thing about a lot of the policy I'm looking at, it looks quite generic. It seems everyone decided to look at the African Youth Charter, or I think the United Nations also had a document on youth, and it's almost like copy paste. It's a lot of the same things. So that those more nuanced things don't kind of feature in a lot of policies. So you've mentioned a lot of I mean, there obviously are great challenges in policy development. What do you think are some of the key policies in Kenya, maybe related to youth, social and economic inclusion?
So you want me to name them? So there's so a lot of the ones that are there center around. So there's the policies, there's the youth charter that then begins to look at, I can send you a list now, all of them are disappearing from my head, but there's a youth charter that then talks about youth inclusion and, youth whatever. A lot of them also revolve around resources that could be given to young people, but for a lot of them are entrepreneurship ones. Okay, so there's a lot also around adolescence youth policies. That is from the Ministry of Health, but somehow they don't feature. You see, nobody ever makes a correlation between that health and because a lot of people forget that a healthy young person is the one that can be socioeconomically empowered, easily socioeconomically, participate socioeconomically, right? And so people don't even include, let's say, the youth policies are under the Ministry of Health as socioeconomic, as having a linkage to so, which I think is a mistake. But a lot of the policies then, like there's the Uwezo fund, there's the multiple funds and programs within the ministries. A lot of them are enterprise ones. There's the Youth Enterprise Development Fund. There is the Women's Fund that also covers young women. There is now they want to consolidate it into what they call Biashara Fund, but people are not clear because all of them are avenues for quote unquote eating. Yeah. I can give you a whole list of it. I mean, I know the content. The names are very...
But it sounds, I get the point that there are a lot of different policies, but they're not integrated. They're maybe not speaking to each other. So many that are touching on issues related to youth, but kind of they don't come together somehow. They're just being held by different departments.
And a lot of them are also donor related. So the World Bank is running the Youth Empowerment Project. The UN now is through UNICEF is running the Generation Unlimited. All of them, if you look at them, I wrote the background paper for the Youth Empowerment Project for the World Bank. And I was involved in the UN Generation Unlimited, and just sort of the paper was supposed to advise the president on what are the strategic youth areas to engage. You see, they're not talking to each other, and yet it's the same purpose.
Sure.
So everybody wants to be involved. And that's the other thing about policy. Again, you remember what I said earlier. I think the issue of interest, it's not just the interest in politicians, but who else is on the table and what are their interests? Why is the UN, for example, not consolidating with what is happening in the World Bank to just do a huge project that benefits all young people? Yeah. So the disconnection, and yet all of them are working. So you find groups that are very, very good at positioning themselves to be able to benefit from all the initiatives.
Yeah.
And so there's double counting of who's benefiting, but there are so many people that haven't benefited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but I think that's as you said, the case, that so many programs funded by different donors, and I mean, it's so difficult for them to actually come together. And I think, I don't know if it's the Kenyan Youth Empowerment Program, but there was one project that I noticed, obviously different funders actually coming together and pooling their resources. And so you had like different, what's the Department for International Development based in the UK, and you had the United Nations, and Swedish, the Swedish Embassy. And, I think, as you say, that's not happening enough, where everyone agrees, like, okay, this seems like a good approach, and pooling the resources together.
But if it's the project I'm thinking about, I mean, it also just went ahead and did publications around youth. And they might as well just have picked one other publication, because there was nothing new they were saying outside what has already been published. And so it almost feels like each one of them wants to have to go back and say, I did some work on youth. Youth is a big problem in Africa. But the real value add for me, I didn't see.
Yeah.
Even in the project I think you're talking about.
Sorry, this one is actually, I've just did a bit of a control find in this report. It was the Zimbabwe Youth Empowerment Program, where you had these different funders coming together. And I mean, it was a budget of about £8 million. Yeah, but so often you do, as you say, it's the World Bank, or it might be the African Development Bank is funding it. But very rarely you find that they're actually coming together. Okay, great.
By the way, the other thing that is interesting for me is this whole issue about getting loans to fund youth projects, because a lot of, in my view, I feel like the narrative comes in the name of, oh, we have this big youth project, but nobody really remembers it's not a grant, it's a loan that is going to be paid. First of all, of course, there is an issue of corruption even in managing those resources. And so one, in policy making, financing, what then would want to go into the main domain of what's the proportion of resources that's going to administration? What's the proportion of resources that's going? So the sustainability part of it is very important.
Yeah.
But much more than looking at those proportions and saying who's benefiting and how much is the benefit. And to be honest, I think only 30% really goes into. But then again, we do the projects and we pride in the numbers of the people were in those projects, but rarely do we come back to say how many people really benefited and was there change.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I'll send you a case study. You may have come across it, or the people doing the KO project might find it. It was a report by the World Bank based on a partnership they had with KEPSA, is a Kenya Private Sector Alliance in Kenya. Yeah, they were implementing the training component and placement component at the first, KO project. And for me, what was interesting is they came back and actually did a good assessment. And it looks like there was some interesting change there, and there were very interesting lessons to learn.
Yeah.
So now the second part of it, because of the politics, they gave it to one of the government, offices. And I don't think it's the same, because the placement is very low. I don't think they can really tell in terms of the change process whether that happened.
That's most definitely a question that I have both for policy and programs, is that lack of evaluation. And even when I I try my luck and send email to these funders, and even I think it was Difford, or yeah, and I've asked him, do you have any reports that I could use to see the evaluation of the project? And all that you can really find is one of the internal final project reports, and it doesn't say much about evaluation. So I agree with you. It's, you know, again, why are people not taking evaluation seriously? You know, are people just throwing money around? Why do you not want to know what your money is doing? You know, so,
the impact assessments are not there.
Yeah. Great. Let me carry on here. I think what I often find with these interview schedules is that, you know, you're already touching on different paths, but there's always
that's true.
There's always this fear that you haven't covered it. Okay, maybe before we go on to programs, I mean, maybe I can just integrate two of the questions here. So maybe just thinking about some of what you would consider the key weaknesses of policy, of youth policy in Kenya, and do you think that these policies speak, do they speak enough to the issues of inclusion and violence prevention?
Yeah, so I think in some way I answered that in the sense that, first of all, we look at violence. I mean, there's a narrow definitions of a lot of these things, right? So we already looked at violence, and people don't think emotional violence is violence, right? They don't think so just a very interesting thing you said here about the project in South Africa and the fact that young men are not getting involved. And you will find that the reason why they're not getting involved may have nothing to do with all these grandiose things we define violence to be. It could be emotional trauma that makes them less confident about going out there to accept opportunities that are available to them. And so if you don't look at it, again, it's definition of terms. If you don't look at that violence from that very huge perspective of, you know, emotional confidence and psychological trauma, for example, as a form of violence, then you miss out on a lot of the reasons why our projects are not being taken up. All right. And that's why when you study a lot of youth and employment projects, one of the things that makes employment or rather those projects successful is this whole issue about behavior change, or, you know, behavior change, soft type of trainings and involvement. And a lot of times in these projects, you realize that people want to train for, I need to make you a mechanic. But you will never be a successful mechanic if you don't know how to keep your books, but also if you don't have the discipline and the honesty to pay back loans, right? And to be faithful in your work. So how do you integrate those soft issues within the definition of violence so that it can be included? And that's one of the biggest, for me, weaknesses of the policy making, is that we have very narrow and conventional forms of violence. Also remember that a lot of these projects adapt that because they're also donor funded. And so what they define as violence is then brought to us as, you must adapt this as violence. And it could be, it's violence is contextual, right? It's very contextual. And so if you don't take into account that context and in a sense allow programs to organically, you know, like come from the ground up, what then tends to happen is that our policy projects and programs are prescriptive. You see, and because of that, people also become mechanical. They're like, hey, look, this project doesn't make sense. I'll implement it anyway because I have the money to do it. And so you find you're throwing money at issues that don't even make sense. And yet, if you listen, like the project, what I told you earlier about the ID cards, it could be that if you just facilitated identity cards in northern Kenya, maybe you would actually deal with the issue of terrorist recruitment. Can you imagine that?
Yeah, just build more public institutions or departments dealing with the registration of births and giving IDs, and it might cost you a lot less than the money that's being thrown around.
Precisely. And even, or decide to work with, because there are no hospital, even if there are hospitals, they are really far between, or even the cultures there believe in birth attendants, right? Then work with birth attendants to make sure that they report. There's a mechanism that they use to report a child that has been born somewhere. So that even when that family disappears to go and herd cattle into the forest because of, pastures and everything, there's a reporting mechanism that makes sure that kid can be recognized.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
No, most definitely. And I think something that you've also touched on around, and it speaks to programs as well, is the soft skills. And I mean, I guess that's something that we can touch on. Maybe if I move that side. Okay. All right, great. So now we're actually able to move on to the program side. So maybe if I can give you some background on the types of programs that we were focusing on, is obviously we put together some selection criteria, and we said we want to look at, because of the issue of the youth bulge, which is such a great challenge. We want to look at large scale programs that are reaching tens of thousands of youth, and not just hundreds of youth. I mean, I guess we potentially miss out on these very small scale pilot projects that have potential, but unfortunately, we had to kind of say, okay, well, the issue of scalability is something we're looking at here. Also, because of our background and interest in public employment programs, that was another contributing factor. We also were looking at programs in the past 10 years. We wanted projects that, were focusing on this, hopefully the social and economic aspects of youth inclusion. And obviously that was a struggle to find ones that balance both the social and the economic side. So kind of with those kind of factors in mind, when it came to Kenya, let me, if I can open up this document here. We had the Kenyan Youth Empowerment Program. Was one of the main programs that I've focused on here. Are you familiar with the Kenya Youth Empowerment Program?
Yeah, I wrote the background paper for it.
Okay.
Now it has become Kenya Youth Empowerment Opportunities Program, because then of the politics in the ministry and the fact that the ministry wanted to be more in charge. So there's the policy. So there's KYEP and KYOP.
Okay.
Kenya Youth Empowerment Opportunities Program. Okay, so I'm familiar, yes.
Awesome. You're definitely familiar with writing the background to it. And I mean, would you consider KYEP as one of the major youth inclusion or youth development programs in Kenya? Or are there potentially other programs that you think have probably had a greater influence?
I definitely think it does. It's one of the big ones. I mean, the resources that have been put there are really, of course it's a loan, but it's quite a huge amount. And I don't recall any project that has that kind of money. So it's one of the major ones. There's another one called the Dalbag project. Dalbag, and it's Dalbag. I'd have to get you all the funders, but I forget the other. MasterCard Foundation is funding that, and it has a lot of this. It's been doing this in Africa to resource youth employment projects, and so they're doing a lot of mapping. Theirs is much more research based, so that their interventions try and, in a sense, use that data to back it up. The KO project is, training, the usual. So you train, and then you place, and then you hopefully get young people to be productive.
Yeah. I mean, I saw from that, I think there were different components to KYEP. Let me kind of open it up this side. The first component was the Kwazikwa Vijana program, which obviously the first phase of it was discontinued. The second component with KEPTA, as you mentioned, and then the third component was the capacity development of the Ministry of Youth Affairs. So let me actually go to the. So overall, what did you say? What do you think of that program? I mean, what were maybe some of the successes and challenges that you kind of see in that program?
Let me just also open my the book where I wrote a lot of these things. It's actually a case study in the book I was doing.
Okay, no, that's great.
So I could just, yeah.
So I'm able to read and reference that chapter.
Yeah. So there's the so the first phase I told you was so I don't know, which one are you reviewing, the Kenya Youth Empowerment Project or the Kenya Youth Empowerment and Opportunities Program?
Is KYOP, has it been completed or is it still currently underway?
So this is the second phase.
Yeah.
The second phase is what now they are calling Kenya Youth Empowerment Opportunities. There's an opportunities in between program.
I think I reviewed the first phase because so another selection criteria was we wanted to have some form of evaluation. For the ongoing programs, it was often difficult. But I mean, if for KYOP, if there is some data out there, I mean, we could still potentially include it, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know whether it has data, but a friend of mine was working on it. But I think because they were hired to evaluate the project, I don't think she can give that information publicly. So, but just to speak about KYEP, the one that you're evaluating, so they were combining 4 factors, right? On the classroom-based and on-the-job training. And then they were doing demand-driven design of skills, okay? Like, for example, if mechanics has demand, then they train for that, all right? Then the government private sector partnerships, but this was purposely for placement in the market, all right? And then the 4th component was the life skills, which is what we are calling behavior change and all those soft skills. So that is increasingly sort of like mainstreamed within, and then they had another component they had to introduce later about trying to do entrepreneurship on the side, right? So how they sort of like structured this is that I think it was a lengthy project that was done in let me see how they structured it. So the program was piloted in Nairobi, Mombasa, and Kisumu, right? And the programs provided 3 months of classroom-based technical training and 2 weeks of life skills training. So they say that the aim of the life skills training was to strengthen life and the non-cognitive skills like communication, conflict resolution, and the general skills. Then there were 5 weeks of business training, all right? And then there was another 5 weeks of sector-specific skills training to promote specific technical skills. And then 3 months of internship in private firms. So the reason KEPSA was there is that it could place people in their different member organizations.
Yeah.
And basically the ones that had the highest uptake were energy, finance, ICT, manufacturing, and tourism. Or rather, they had identified those are the main sectors where they want to place people. In terms of actual successes, they say that, so they worked with the people aged between 15 and 29. They did offer some stipend, like $70 at the time, to compensate young people, let's say, for transport, food costs during the programs.
That's important.
And then, then they had a monthly compensation of about $35 to offset time spent overseeing, or the organizations were given about $35 for the work they put in to oversee interns. But they say overall 76% of those who are selected by employers to participate in the full program completed the programs. So which is a bit high, like 3/4 of people going through up to the internship level was considered quite high, because they say a lot of projects you get about 40 to 50% doing the same.
Mm.
Then they also say that, and that is credited to this private sector partnership.
Yeah.
And the trainings, okay? And the fact that, of course, then it becomes like a formal way. So there's a bit of that formal understanding that gives the employer some form of confidence.
I think
Then
what I also read from KEPSA, they said, and that's what, maybe just to bring it in from what I've been reading, is the importance of the matching process. So KEPSA said that they had to actually lengthen their process because it took a bit longer to match the young job seeker with an employer, but that seemed to be something that was working quite well for them, in terms of contributing to the higher maintaining the young people in their positions is they spent more time trying to work on making a good match there.
Yeah, that definitely. And one of the things in this second phase that they've really had trouble with is that particular element of matching, and even getting matching, even placement, because government doesn't have those kind of relationships. Then they say the cost of delivering the program was about 1,150. So this kind of program is what they call the 360 degree. And in a lot of reviews, they say this 360 is the most expensive, but it also is the most beneficial.
Yeah.
Because you're touching different things and eventually placing the people, and they cost around this much. There's one I think I read about Venezuela or some Latin American country that also, I mean, the cost is similar, but they are credited to be among the most successful because they integrate the different facets of what a young employer needs.
I think in South Africa, they call it the comprehensive approach.
Yes.
You're working on both the supply and demand side and the interaction between the two.
Exactly. Because what tends to happen is that a lot of the programs then fund the supply side. So again, you keep having an oversupply of workers, but very little demand. So and as you can see from the 360 or comprehensive projects, the demand side is a much harder one to work on. Yes.
And so you put an actual chapter together on this, and I mean, is it something you could share with me?
I could share with you the project evaluation for this particular project. Well, though I'm supposed to publish the book, so I don't know. I could give you to read it, but whatever you just lift out of it, just let me know so that we know how to, because the book needs to be published at some point.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
no problem. So it's
forthcoming. It has percentages about how much, like how many young people benefited. Apparently, for this project, there were more female beneficiaries. I mean, like the female beneficiaries seem to, or rather the impact was more on the women than the men. I didn't get the reason for that.
Yes, I also saw that often and a lot of literature seems to say this. I mean, why is it that young men, even despite the support, seem to find it easier to be maintained in these positions? And a lot of the time they're saying it's because of the gender roles and the caregiver role that's ascribed to women. But the organization, I think not an organization, a group of authors here in South Africa are suggesting, obviously it's quite a complicated process. It's not just the caregiver roles. It's not just the sexual harassment and discrimination that they experience in the workplace. There's probably multiple factors that we still don't understand around why you still find more men kind of benefiting from these opportunities.
But in this project, the productivity of women went higher than that of males. So I would imagine it's because women are more disadvantaged because of the things you're saying, so that when they get an opportunity like this, it's easier for them to be able to be much more to get a much more productive opportunity than the men, because the men, the opportunities usually are there. I don't know whether that makes sense.
Definitely.
Yeah. But it was interesting to see, the productivity. Maybe that's one of the things you should test in the field on this. I don't know whether you're going to do field like assessments, like when you're assessing the project in South Africa, maybe that issue of productivity between the genders would be an interesting one, and to see why apart from why men are not, for those who go through the training until the end, eventually, who does employability go higher for women than for men, and why?
I'm actually going to make a note of that. So here in South Africa, one of the key person looking at youth employment is a person called Professor Lauren Graham at the University of Johannesburg. So I'll definitely pose that to her and ask her what the gender differences in,
and particularly in productivity, when women are trained. And I've seen those studies a lot where when you afford training opportunities for both men and women, first of all, even when it comes to, apart from completion rates, differences and all that, when it comes to just monitoring the people who finished, all had equal opportunities. If you monitor for the women, their productivity goes higher. Productivity then doesn't mean that they earn more, but it just means that you pull a lot more into much valuable positions than you pull the men.
Yeah. And maybe kind of, as you alluded to, it's women maybe there's still, because maybe men find it easier to find opportunities, women might have to prove themselves more, and that contributes to this higher productivity.
So I can give you the percentages so that I don't have to bore you reading a script about how many percentages finished and blah blah blah.
Would you like to share that over this kind of meeting, or?
Yeah. Just let me actually send it to you as we speak, so that I don't.
Great.
There's actually the report was online of the person who did the evaluation for the World Bank, Honorati. It's a report by Honorati 2015. In fact, let me give you the link. You can find it. I found it on Google Scholar.
Okay, great.
I'll get you the report shortly.
No problem.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I'll probably also just follow up.
It provides very good insights on that particular project.
Okay, great. I mean, I think if I'm looking at the interview schedule now, again, I think we've covered some areas, and so you've mentioned, one question I had, Jay, is about the potential of these programs to prevent violence, and you touched on that, saying that maybe the social aspect, or what's called the soft skills. The soft skills is something that maybe we need to focus on a lot more. And you also mentioned that we need to have broader definitions of violence. We really need to put more effort into considering what we see as violence. Those are the two things I picked up on, how you feel programs can better prevent violence. Is there anything else maybe that you wanted to add to that?
So sorry, just repeat the question.
Is maybe, how can these programs perhaps better prevent violence, or how can we enhance their violence prevention potential?
Yeah, I think my sense is the fact that we need to also understand the structure of violence, all right? So if you think about how society is structured, and that's why the issue of complexity in a lot of things have to be taken into account. It's because if you think about African societies, they've been mainly patriarchal, but the world is changing, right? If you said your project now, or the program you're involved in, also works on GBV, and I don't know from your sense whether you see GBV rising. In Kenya, certainly that is becoming, particularly in this COVID season, it has really just shot through the roof. I read a statistic that it has increased by about 150 or 149%.
Sure.
Which is a huge number. But when you look at it and ask yourself, why is it that people who probably know better, there are more rights, there are more consequences for violence, why is it increasing? And then you cannot, in my view, talk about violence without unpacking that structure of patriarchy and the developments that are going on, because, that system is dying off. Women are getting more empowered. Women no longer culturally and traditionally accept certain things. But I feel like the male, because patriarchy worked for them, they are, in a sense, not as quick in changing from the system and shifting. So there's a bigger disconnect and a bigger tension there that needs to be unpacked beyond saying young men are angry. Why are they angry? There's a system that enabled them to survive and to thrive. That system is being challenged, and that system then they don't know what to do with it, and we are not spending time empowering them and educating them. The girls have been very empowered and educated. Don't accept this, don't accept that, but no one is, in a sense, making the bridge. That's for me the first and that's where the soft skills come in, because a lot of men don't know how to process. Young men particularly don't know how to process this thing. All right. Then the second thing, obviously, is the other. So remember, this patriarchy sort of like system. So is a form of dysfunction, and it's not just among the young people. It's also based on the parents and the homes they grew up in. So that if you grew up in violence, then obviously that's the cue you have on how the world operates. And so for me, I don't also know how to connect that in terms of policy, the generational issues of violence, you know, and in that regard. But it's something definitely that, because I feel like you can have these young people that you're trying to help, but what about the systems or the things or the circumstances that keep them bound in that sort of like psyche of violence?
Yeah.
But the second one is the socioeconomic hardships. I mean, the modern world now is full of so many things. So I'll give you one among young people that I wrote about in this book, and is what the aspirational gap. So social media, globalization. I'm sure you've come across the term glocalization, right? So there's the glocalization, yes. So there is the local situation. So a young person can be living in slums with a lot of deprivation, right? So no school, no water, nothing. But they have a phone, and the phone opens them up to a world of the ideals that they could be. So it opens up to the streets of the fashion streets of Paris. So this person, circumstantially, they're in such dire situations, but mentally they dream. The gap between their reality and their dreams is completely outrageous.
Yeah.
And so the anger becomes this inability to bridge this gap.
Yeah.
Okay. So that this young person then begins to feel and to see these injustices more, because the frustration of that gap is bigger. Think about, I don't know about yourself and how you grew up, but for me, I look at my parents and the fact that just being in the city and just finding a job and working, my mom worked the same job all her life.
Sure.
Her aspirations were that much. I mean, she didn't think she could change a job and double her salary. But her contentment makes her less violent because her aspiration gap and her reality are very small.
Yeah.
And so for me, one of that biggest thing is we are not equipping young people to be able to handle that aspirational gap. Sure. And systems are definitely not working towards helping the bridge, so that the system, when I say the system, is whether it's governance, policy, financing, anything, school system, anything, is not trying to make this person's life better so that you're, in a sense, coming closer to that aspiration. And so that for me is a very big issue.
Yeah.
And that's why young people are so disconnected and they are so depressed, and they are so, because it's not making sense. Again, what we haven't realized in terms of systems is that, you know, we're now in a knowledge economy. You're constantly bombarded with these things, and that media, that global connection and the media of what could be versus what they have just doesn't add up. Yeah. And we're not doing anything about it. So for me, I find it's pointless to discuss violence and policy if you're not gonna think through the systemic issues that are the causes of those things in the first place. And I'm not trying to suggest there's any easy answers to it. I'm just saying acknowledging that begins to help us think, how can that be, in a sense, factored into some sense? Because then you would find that the project talking about policy needs to discuss maybe corruption. It needs to discuss some things that would never feature in a policy dialogue of young people and violence.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's such a great insight that you shared. I mean, for me, I saw the inequality and what I've obviously just read up on it a little bit, but that the experience of that inequality and, as you said, the aspirational gap and what the term in relative deprivation, as you say, I think it's something that is barely understood. And these qualitative studies of the experiences of these great differences that we see between ourselves and others, and that frustration in not being able to realize your aspirations and better understanding these factors that shape what we aspire to in our lives. As I totally agree that needs to be something that is even brought into a school level, and is probably also quite a big problem when it comes to, so for example, I saw in Uganda, in some of the northern Ugandan programs, is young people, what they consider as a decent wage was the equivalent of about 400 Rand, which I think, I don't know what, my maths is not good, but I don't know how many US dollars that is. I think it's about 30 something US dollars a month. But in South Africa, what we consider as a decent wage is about 3,000 Rand a month. And just
even among Black youth.
So our minimum wage in South Africa is 20 Rand an hour. It's about 2,800 Rand a month. That's what we consider a minimum wage. And so with something like that community work program I mentioned, it only pays up to 700 Rand for 8 days of work a month. And so really that you can see these big differences already in what young people consider decent wages. And it ties into what you're saying around what are aspirations, what type of jobs do you want young people want? And do these programs even create those types of jobs? And as you said, are these programs aspirational enough? Do they meet young people's aspirations? And most likely not.
You have mentioned something absolutely so critical. I did a study in the stuff I was telling you about, the Africa Youth Project. And we did an Africa-wide study and asked people, where do you want to live and work in the future? And it was absolutely amazing to see that young people don't want to be what is being called entrepreneurs. And that was fascinating for me, because I said, wait a minute, every project I know, including the KO project and others, are putting in billions of dollars in training young people to be entrepreneurs. So, of course, you dig deeper. And one of the things I found is that they have no problem with being business people. But imagine their preference is to work in formal employment first, get the skills, and formal employment, of course, then means very high profile jobs that are earning the kind of money you're talking about. And then once they learn the ropes of it, they do not want to start what they call small precarious businesses that fail within 2 years. They want to be able to go into form. They want to be big business players, having put in the time and, the kind of resources that then they can, create. And so then I asked myself, look at the policy disconnect between, here is World Bank trying to make everybody an informal business person.
Yeah. And I guess for me, I mean, there's that it ties to, you've been very generous with your time and I appreciate it, but I don't want to exploit it too much. I guess this is one of the questions in the conclusion section of the interview was, I mean, you obviously have a great interest in youth demographics and the youth bulge. And I mean, in South Africa, it's up to 1 million young people a year enter the labor market. In Kenya, I guess it's quite close to that.
It's about 700, 700.
Yeah. And a lot of these programs, if we see the labor absorption rates in South Africa, they at 20%. So each quarter, only 20% of those looking for work are finding employment in South Africa. In Kenya, I'm not sure what the
it's 100, 1/7, 100,000, 100,000 to 200,000.
Okay.
Out
So,
of 700,000.
Right. And that's the thing we're considering is these programs are considered a great success when they bring 10,000 people into the labor market, or they create 1,000 new jobs. But the size of the problem seems to be so great. And when I was reading about it, you find it difficult to not feel a bit helpless and to feel a bit depressed around the situation. And that made me think, are these entrepreneur programs almost representing that despondency that, look, we will never be able to create enough jobs. The formal sector is not going to be able to do this. So your only hope is really to employ yourself. I mean, what would you think about this idea of self-employment? It's really this idea that's being pushed.
Yeah. So I like this question because then it tells me my book is ready for the market. So one thing I think about is the fact that, first of all, this whole move to make youth self-employed is exonerating government from its role and responsibility. In the sense that you're supposed to provide a system and an environment that provides employment. But now you're giving that responsibility of creating employment to young people. So you are, in a sense, inverting the problem, and that's not okay. And so young people, in my view, no one is taking that responsibility because you don't have the capacity to shoulder that kind of responsibility. And so for me, I feel like it's like you're saying, it is failing or not being successful because it is precisely based on a faulty model, right? Now, again, I said that if you don't think about why did we get here in the first place, then you will realize you will never fix the problem by trying to make everybody then take on your responsibility. So if you think about, South Africa is a little different because your informal sector is very small. But in the rest of Africa, the informal sector is actually 80 to 90%, right? So of course, then where are these young people, in a sense, quote unquote, defaulting to when they cannot be absorbed in the formal? It's in the rural economy, which is unproductive, which nobody is really, a lot of African governments don't put in the resources to help that rural economy work well. The second one is in the informal, which then is almost criminalized in policy, right? So if you see like street vending, the city council police will come and start chasing all these vendors. You're not supposed to be here. So in a sense, it's almost like you're operating in a cat and mouse game. And so you cannot be productive to your fullest at that point. And so unless we acknowledge that the rural and the informal are the default places, and pay attention to what policy mechanisms can we put in place to make this more productive. And so that young people can then, if that's the place where there are opportunities, they can naturally then you increase their productivity there. We are creating a fallacy. So government policy, if you have seen, is on PPPs, right? And this false narrative that, private sector is the way to youth employment. How is it? And yet, private sector thrives on reducing cost to maximize profit. Reducing cost means that the first cost you reduce is workforce. Now, where we are right now in youth and employment, you need labor intensive. So those two are incompatible by all means. I don't care which professor says it is compatible. Just logically and simply, it cannot work. All right. And based on that, then you shouldn't be putting all your eggs in PPPs. You should be looking at what else, where is the productivity? So a young farmer, for example, in Kenya, that will produce maize in an acre at, I don't know, let me just give you a random number. And their productivity will be, let's say 10 bags per acre. In other places, where there's high productivity, it will be like 200 bags an acre. Why is it not possible for us to just then get our rural people to get 200 bags an acre? That way you kill several birds with one stone. It's labor intensive. You're able to get, whether it's you absorb the labor, you do food security, you try and deal with your environmental issues all in one, right? So the point I make is, unless we are able to resolve those structural issues, and it's from independence, and this comes to the issue of the liberal economy, where you're being told, again, the other place to do this is industrialization, right?
Yeah.
So sorry, I'm very passionate about this, so you're not gonna stop me in 2
Please,
minutes, but
go on.
I'll try and hurry up. Is the fact that manufacturing obviously is another place for labor intensive sort of like opportunity. But what has happened when the countries that are now telling us to liberalize or not to protect our markets, their industries were infants, or rather their industries were young, they protected those industries.
Yeah.
And that's the only way they were able to grow. Now at the stage where we need to protect so that we grow, and in a sense even nationalize some of these, interactions, you're being told, no, you have to open up your markets. So nobody is pushing back and saying, how do we protect ourselves, or even how do we negotiate better deals out there so that we create employment for our people? So for me, the structural anomalies is where the biggest problem is. And it doesn't matter how much entrepreneurship we send out to young people. It is not gonna work unless we resolve the structural issues that we have.
For sure. I really appreciate that. That's why I have no qualms with asking you to add. Maybe, I don't know, have you ever read a chapter called The Elusive Quest for Inclusive Growth in Sub-Saharan Africa?
No, I think I came across it.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's the same. And one of the chapters, it's really the same thing as you're saying, this neoliberal approach to development, and it's never really going to answer this problem. And people are saying the agriculture first, or do we use an industrial approach to development? And as you say, this is big part of the problem. Even what you mentioned around, so with colonialism, is we entered into the global race slightly behind a lot of these other countries that were just exploiting us, and so when they were able to protect their industries, and they had a head start, and when we then come into the market, we're not able to be at the same level, and there's this constant game of always being behind. Some people are saying, no, Africa should be the manufacturing hub of the world. But again, you always have companies looking for the cheapest labor supplies. So, do you really want young people working in what's they called? It's the working poor. Do you want young people to be working but remain in chronic poverty? Or do we want to actually say, let's put agriculture first and create more of these kind of agrarian or pastoral policies, as you suggested? And that often doesn't feature. Policies are still very, they're quite broad, they're not detailed. And there's not maybe these strong links between the agricultural departments and what these youth policies are saying as well.
And you see that the other thing that complicates these things, and that's why when you look at things from a systems perspective, it really makes a lot of sense, is, for example, if I produce a shoe in Kenya and we produce Nike shoes made by very poor, remember the aspirational gap. These young people, first of all, don't want to be working poor, and they will be restless working poor, right? But I'm in my consciousness, I am made to think that a Nike shoe, which is produced here because it's just that it's foreign and a foreign owned company, right? And a Kenyan entrepreneur produces a shoe. I would rather buy Nike than buy that Kenyan shoe. So even mentally, there's a lot of work to be done about how do we think and process about our own how do we disempower ourselves? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that it's an important thing. It's interconnected. It's intertwined. And the day we come into terms with, look, this has been an exploitative process all along. It's not been beneficial. We're as good as anybody is, and then we can lead the world. I mean, you've seen the some of the innovations like the money technology, the mobile technology, and all.
Yeah.
They're running after, right? But it's because somebody dared to think what can be. You see, if you actually do the history of credit cards in Africa, it failed. In the West, you cannot operate without a credit card, but in Africa, it was not possible. But we created something that was very context specific, and because of that, it completely thrived, completely overturned. It was a game changer in terms of the banks. And so if we can get many more of this, coming up, and people being able to innovate for this context and use these products, and those products, and then a system that enables those things to thrive, I think we would game change in a lot of ways and leapfrog in very many ways.
Yeah.
But it's not as simple.
For sure. I was just about to say, it's so multifaceted. As you said, it's this mind shift to supporting local industries and breaking away from buying these goods that aren't adding value or supporting local youth. But I very much like the points that you've been making. And you mentioned there's a book. So hopefully the book is coming out soon. Because I want to reference a lot of your work, but it's not ready to be referenced yet. Okay.
Yeah, I need to really, there was a last chapter I needed to do on just looking at future trends and that, but I'm not getting the time to do it. So I need to pay attention before it's bypassed by many things. So I definitely will take a cue from this interview to try and finish it.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully the conversation has just inspired you to carry on with it. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I think maybe my last question is just to you. I mean, I guess I could continue asking you questions the whole day. But maybe just if you could if you were invited into this policy space, which I'm sure you have been, what are maybe some of the maybe one or two key kind of points that you would like to put across? If you had your 5 minutes to put your policy recommendations forward, what would those two recommendations be?
In terms of youth and socioeconomic empowerment of young people, I think ours is not to prescribe. I keep saying that government has no power or even capacity to provide employment for young people. I think the government's role can only be to facilitate an environment where young people can thrive on their own. And so as governments, what I would ask is, can we be true to that process of providing an environment where every young person in Africa is able to thrive from birth to death, to at least at the point where they transition into adulthood? Can we be true in terms of, making sure they feed right so that they mentally grow, making sure that they're able to have the kind of education system, making sure that they're able to have the kind of exposure and that provides them to think, to dream, to be, so that in the end, because we would be amazed at how they would create a different environment for Africa. That actually would be my contribution.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, definitely. I think I'd definitely support that. Is that should just be that sole focus is helping people to thrive and reach their full potential, and if government really, I'm not sure what sidetracks them, but if they could just put that as their sole focus, that would be great.
Yeah. Wow, I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much. I look forward to all the publications that you have in store. I hope I could get copies as well when you're done.
This is great. And kind of actually recording this, I mean, maybe at the end of it, I would actually like to ask, the different contributors, would they mind if we shared these interviews, because they're really insightful, you know.
Okay,
So
I would love to have the other ones that you have.
yeah, I want to share this with you, obviously. So I'll
Mm-hmm.
once we end it, I'll try to share it with you. But I think it's a really insightful conversation, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much as well for reaching out, and all the best in all that enormous work you have to get through to the publication.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Katindi.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.